And if you look on that first handout there, where it's got the outline, you'll see underneath Sertalange there what I said, a good summary of the intellectual. And this is how he defines this. He says, the intellectual I have in view is a man of wide and varied knowledge, complementary to a special study thoroughly pursued. He loves the arts and natural beauty. His mind shows itself to be one in everyday occupations and in meditation. His is the same man in the presence of God, of his fellows, and of his maid, carrying with him a world of ideas and feelings that are not only written down in books and in discourses, but flow into his conversation with his friends and guide his life. And I love that definition because what you see there is that though he is an intellectual, though he is learning and pursuing knowledge, that really comes out not just in what he learns from books and discourses, but what actually flows out of him into conversation with God and with friends, and in some ways even with ourselves. And so I thought that was just such a helpful way of kind of encapsulating this idea of the intellectual life. This doesn't mean that we're secluded entirely from society. It means that we're integrated in society. It means that the things that we are learning then flow out in discourse with others. And what I think then that looks like is, I hope what this conference will be, is that as each of us have been filled up with knowledge and understanding through pursuing this understanding and knowledge, that we then share that with one another and that flows out. And so that's kind of really what I'm hoping this conference can be, is that gathering of intellectuals, if you will, in which we're really just having conversations and sharing with one another. So on the second point there, is it worth pursuing? This is really what I've spent a lot of my time with, because as I think about the intellectual life, I think in some ways it's a misconception from a lot of people about what the intellectual life is that makes them think that it's not rewarding, it's not valuable, it's not purposeful perhaps. And I think if we have that misunderstanding that the intellectual does nothing for other people, as they're only about themselves and what they can learn, then we certainly have a problem. But I think if we rightly define the intellectual and the intellectual life, I think we find that it really is worth pursuing. And so as I was kind of wrestling with what does that look like, this will come back in just a little bit, but you can kind of see on the handout there. One of the things that I'm going to propose is that if we want our students to live the intellectual life, we have to model it for them. And so sometimes that means kind of entering into their misery, their studies, right? You might call it incarnational teaching. I'm asking them to write this paper, maybe I'll do it as well. And so last year I had them writing a paper on the book Fantastes by George MacDonald. And man, they were just not happy with me. Why do we have to write this paper? And I said, you know what? I'm going to write this paper too. And what was funny is that during the class, they would come up to me and they were working on it in class, and I would meet with all of them. So at the time that they're getting lots and lots of help from me, I'm not working on my paper at all. And so I would work on my paper at home on the weekends and all these things, and I turned in my paper early. And they were like, wait, what? I had sent all of the papers to our college's writing lab, and I slipped mine in without a name on it so that they would give feedback just like I was a high school student. And that was kind of fun to get the feedback from the college student, like, this is a really dumb point. I was like, yeah, it really was. I better hope you never have my class. And so it was kind of fun to really step into that with them and to go, this is what I'm asking them to do, and I'm willing to do it myself. Now, I can't do every homework assignment that they do because we have other responsibilities. But on occasion, I think it's helpful to step into that. So I'm asking my seniors to write a paper for the Chrysostom Oratory Contest that the ACCS does. And they follow Quintilian's 6-point structure of kind of classical rhetoric to give this speech. And so I decided, you know what, if I've got to really wrestle with what the intellectual life is, I'll write that paper. And so I gave you that paper. It is a rough draft. Please don't judge me on the basis of this paper. But I turned it in early. I only told them a day ago that I was writing one as well. And so while they're kind of stressing out about theirs due next week, I'm just handing mine out to other people who write better than I do and say, here you go, read this. Largely unedited and not satisfactorily completed. But I wanted you to have something. Because I think at sometimes I'm a perfectionist. And so one of the things I see about my struggles in the intellectual life is I don't really want to put anything out there until I'm like 100% satisfied. This is really good. People are going to like me for this. And it's like sometimes what we need to do is go, you know what, this needs a lot of work, but you can help me make it better. So here you go. So this paper that I handed out to you, this is an invitation, first of all, to read it if you want to. And second of all, to give me feedback, right? To email me next week and go, hey, I did read your paper. I have some suggestions, and I would love to hear those. I'm inviting those, because I think one of the things in intellectual life that we need to model for our students is a willingness to receive critical feedback. And I think what they need is a willingness to give critical feedback in a way that's uplifting and encouraging, yet not like, you did such a great job, this is amazing. And then they hand it into their teacher and it's like, this is kind of bad. How do I say this in a nice way? C- or D+. You know, like you're giving grades on it, and well, they've gotten feedback from their peers that says, this is amazing, you're such a great writer, and they need to work on it a lot. And so I think we can even model that aspect as well. Here's how you give critical feedback in a way that's encouraging and uplifting, but honest to the work. So please be honest, but be kind when you do that for me. So that's really what I was wrestling with. And so in this question of, is it worth pursuing, that's really what I pursue in that essay, is exploring, hey, what is the purpose of the intellectual life, and does it fit with the Christian life? And so I kind of have 5 points in there, and we're not going to go through these. I'll just mention them for you. If you flip to the second page of that essay, you'll see them there. That first full paragraph, about halfway down, it says, first, the foundational premises of the intellectual life are biblical and Christocentric. Second, the presuppositions of the intellectual life are theologically grounded. Third, the purpose of the intellectual life is to glorify God and love our neighbor, the same mission as the church. Fourth, the practices of the intellectual life discipline the mind for godliness, form godly habits of the mind, and produce a life of contemplation. Fifth, the product of the intellectual life is attested in the historic Orthodox creeds, which serve as a unifying doctrine for the universal church. And so really what I'm trying to explore here is that the intellectual life really matches very closely with biblical and theological goals and missions of the church. And so one of the things that I've been working on writing a lot as well is about the way that the church should be involved in classical Christian education, because I think that the mission of both is about forming us into people who are more human, or more appropriately living out our character in the image of God. And so the more that I reflect on that, the more that I see that the goal of the church and the goal of classical Christian education should be working together instead of working separately. And sometimes I see that even in a classical Christian education, we can go, this is what you do at church, this is what you do at school, and they never meet. And I think that's detrimental to our students. So this is one of the ways that I've been really kind of wrestling with that. And so if the purposes of the intellectual life really do match closely with what our mission is as individual Christians and as the church, then I think it's worth pursuing. And so that's what I do in that essay. So I encourage you, as you have time and desire, to read that and give me some feedback. But we'll kind of move on from there as some of the background. So as far as who should pursue this, what I'm suggesting is that everyone should pursue it to some extent. I'm not suggesting that everyone should devote their lives to it, should devote additional years of education formally to it to get degrees. I'm not saying everyone has to be a teacher or a scholar, but I do think that everyone to some extent should pursue this idea of an intellectual life. Joseph Pieper, in his book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, quotes Aquinas, and at first he says, the capacity to wonder is among man's greatest gifts. And he goes on to say that this was proof for Aquinas that man could only find peace and rest in the contemplation of God. And so this notion of really resting in God, of having peace in God, of this life of contemplation, which I think is what we are pursuing, that the intellectual life feeds into that. It's one of the really, I think, focused and purposeful ways that we can live a life of contemplation. Because as we sit, I think, before the face of God and say, God, who am I? Who are you? How does this relationship look? How am I supposed to live in contact with others? It's definitely something that requires the life of the mind. And as we cultivate the habits of the intellectual life, I think we're cultivating spiritual disciplines as well. And so I'm suggesting everyone should pursue it to some extent. So then, if that's the case, and this is what I defend in the paper, how do we cultivate this life in our students? This is really where I want us to spend our time today. And I think one of the first things I've found about cultivating the life in students is that you have to spark their curiosity. Something that we're not interested in is not something that we're going to pursue, and I'll talk later about this, but intellectual life is hard work. I think we all know this. It requires sacrifice, it requires discipline, it requires mental and emotionally taxing practices. And we're not going to do that if we're not interested. Right? If someone didn't care about a sport, they're not going to wake up early to go work out. They're not going to stay hours after school to practice. They're not going to spend time in the summers when they're on vacation working on that sport. But if they enjoy that, if they love that, then they're going to put in the time and the effort to do that. And I think before we can ask students, be an intellectual, do the intellectual life in whatever degree that we're asking them to do that, they have to be curious about it. They have to love that in some way or another. And so on this handout, what I've done is I've taken a lot of the different quotes from this book by Sertalange, and I've broken them into 6 different categories just to kind of help us look. And if you flip all the way to the back, there's a category that I labeled spiritual. These are my categories, but these are all his practices. And the first one under spiritual says, every intellectual work begins by a moment of ecstasy. Now, what is this ecstasy but a flight upwards, away from self, a forgetting to live our own poor life, in order that the object of our delight may live in our thought and in our heart. And in the context of what he's talking about, I think that one of the things we see with a spark of curiosity is we stop thinking so much about ourselves and we begin to think about something external to us. And ultimately, the goal is that thing external to us leads us to this transcendent truth of who God is. And so we see in that thing a spark, and it's really a divine spark because it leads us back to who God is and who he's created us to be, and whatever this thing is we're curious about, whether it's, I got really excited in the fall about the golden ratio. I was talking to my wife at dinner, my poor wife. I was talking to my wife at dinner about the golden ratio, and she's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I said, well, neither do I. And then the next day, on our date, we went to a bookstore, because that's what we do. That's what I do. And I found a book on the golden ratio, so of course I bought it and started reading it. And for me, that was something I was curious about, the way in which this number reflected God and his design of all of creation. And so that was an example for me of like a spark of curiosity that got me thinking and ultimately directed me back towards God. And that's what we want for our students, is to spark that curiosity. The second thing is we need to feed them on intellectual food. Right? If you want to teach somebody to love steak, you can't just feed them chocolate cake, because no one's ever going to stop eating chocolate cake. Right? Steak is really good, but chocolate cake is great too. And so if they're just eating the chocolate cake, they don't know that there's something out there that tastes really good, that's good for them. I still believe that. Don't tell me that red meat's bad for you. It'll be a bad deal. But that there's something there that has substance, right? That can really sustain you. And so this is, I think, in a lot of ways for me, what I love about the great books. I love reading a lot of modern books, books of theology, books on culture. I don't really like so much modern literature, although occasionally I run into something that I can read and either suffer through or actually enjoy. But there's nothing wrong with new books. But there's something about the great books that have stood the test of time that prove that they are that meat. Right? There's something that we can feed upon, and that's an intellectual food. And if you flip under this category of mental practices to the second page, about halfway down that page, there's a quote that says, "Genius has no date." It's a quote from page 114 and 115 in the book. He says, "Genius has no date. When eternal things are in question, it is wisdom to turn to the man who, at any date in time, succeeded in piercing most deeply into the heart of eternity." That's the kind of thing we can feed on, is something that pierces deep into the heart of eternity. That's what I want to spend my time feeding on. Yeah, there are other things that are worth our time in moderation, but that's the kind of thing that we can feed them on. And so I think there's always a tendency, and I think Kyle's going to do a presentation on this later on about teaching Thomas Aquinas to high schoolers and other exercises in futility, right? But I think we know it's not an exercise in futility. Not to spoil your talk here, I'm actually encouraging you to go to his talk. But we know that it's not an exercise in futility. If you go to the rest of the culture and you go, hey, we're going to hand Thomas Aquinas to a high school sophomore, they're like, you're dumb. It's like, no, you're dumb, you can't read this. No. Don't say that, that's mean. But I think we recognize that when we put great books in the hands of students and we teach them to love what we love, we got to love it first. That's a spoiler alert for the next part of my presentation. But teach them to love these things. Show them how these things pierce deep into the heart of eternity. they can wrestle with it and they can learn from it, and they're feeding on something that continues to give back. I don't think anyone, if they got into Aquinas, will reach a point in their life where they go, well, I've read everything there is to know in Aquinas and I understand it all, and I really gain nothing from reading it anymore. We can't get there. And that's just one author. And then you start picking up the other church fathers, and you pick up Shakespeare, and you just go, I'm never going to have enough time. Well, maybe you can read Shakespeare in heaven. I still believe that. So you do have time, it's just on the other side of the resurrection, right? And so I think there's this picture here of feeding on things that are worth feeding on. And so feed them that intellectual food, and I think they will learn to appreciate it. Third, build in time for these practices. Here's one of the crazy things about this. We all recognize that once we graduated school, or maybe even while you were in school, you're working, you have a family, life happens. The time kind of flitters away, and you have to physically make it happen in the schedule. We have these students for 6, 7, 8 hours every single day. So let's use that time well. We have them already for the time. Right? This is one of the only periods of their life where they're devoting multiple hours a day to the intellectual life. So let's not waste it, right? Let's teach them to see that as we've already built in this time for you. We're not asking you to, maybe we are asking them to go home for 4 hours at night and do more of that. I don't know. I'm not a fan of 4 hours of homework, but we are asking them during the school day to press into what that looks like and to do that. And we're saying this is valuable for you. And if we can convince them and show them the value of that, we've already built in the time for these practices for them. And then the fourth thing, we need to model it, and we need to share it with our students. And so some of the ways that I try to do this is by telling stories. I'm a big storyteller with my students. Sometimes they get a little bit off the rabbit trail, but I always tell them that if you know what your destination is, the rabbit trail really is the point, because I know how to get them back there. So there are times where I'm wandering deep down the rabbit trail, and they think he's never getting back. And then Mr. Doloff, my boss, will walk in, and they're like, you can see the look on their face, like he's in so much trouble right now. He's just totally, and just boom, right back on track. And like, how did you do that? It's because I knew where I was going, kind of, right? But I like to tell them those stories because I do think there's a point to those stories, and sometimes the point of those stories is just, hey, the other day for fun, I was reading Thomas Aquinas. Hey, the other day for fun, I was reading Athanasius' On the Incarnation, and they're like, you're a nerd. And I go, guilty. But here's what I learned. And you share that with them, and they go, oh, that's kind of cool. I like that. And they maybe don't go pick that book up at home and read it on their own, perhaps, but maybe someday they will. So I like to tell them stories, which shares a little bit about how I'm trying to live that life. Sometimes those stories are funny about me sitting in a chair reading a book and my son wanting to play tickle game or something like that. But the interruptions, I think, also are encouraging to them. So I think we need to share what we're learning. Tell those stories and share what we're learning. And then, as I already mentioned, I think sometimes we need to enter into their their education. Kind of an incarnational teaching. Step into what does it look like for what they're doing right now. Hey, that thing I just asked them to do, would I want to do that? And if I wouldn't want to do that, why would I do it anyway? And then share that with them. And I think that can help cultivate the intellectual life in students, because there's a very real Christian aspect I think you can recognize to incarnational teaching, right? Is that the God of the universe took on human flesh so that he could sympathize with our weaknesses. I think it's overlooked in our quick move to Jesus died for my sins. Like, Jesus also lived in a pretty messed up world so that he can sympathize with my weaknesses. Like, wow, can I sympathize with my students' weaknesses? Because if I can't really call them to an intellectual life that I want them to live, because I'm not willing to step into that with them. Now, I've already stepped into that for way more years than most of them will. But it's still something that I think is helpful for us to do. And so really, I think you recognize that the answer then to how we cultivate the intellectual life of our students is that we have to cultivate it first in ourselves. To call them to something that we're not willing to do ourselves is pretty much impossible. The do as I say, not as I do kind of thing doesn't really work very well. hey, do this, practice this, read this. Well, I'm not doing that. I read the newspaper and that's it, right? I think we need to do the kinds of things we're calling them to. So that means we've got to spark curiosity ourselves, and we don't maybe have someone making us do it for a grade. We just got to go, what am I interested in? What am I excited about? What really gets my attention? It doesn't have to be the golden ratio or Thomas Aquinas. It can be like sabermetrics in baseball. Any of you know what I'm talking about? None of you are baseball. That's okay. That's cool. Right? I'm a big baseball fan. And so really about 30, 40 years ago, they started realizing that the way that baseball statistics were trending didn't really help them explain how they won baseball games. So they said, what if we stopped paying attention to those statistics and started figuring out what characteristics actually helped us win games? And now let's quantify that. And began transforming the way that they drafted players and signed players and who they were going to play, and it's changed the game, and I find it fascinating. So I like dig into all these really weird baseball statistics that nobody knows about. But that's exciting for me, and really, in the process of that, I promise you it can lead you back to God, because God is a Cubs fan. All right, I just lost like 3/4. So, want to practice those things and encourage our students then to step into that as well. And so what I have here for you is a huge list of practices and quotes from Sir Talange's book, and he's by no means the only one who's written on this, but I only had time to read a few books on this, and his was by far the most helpful for the actual practices. I would also highly recommend a book that I mentioned in that paper by Bradley Green called The Gospel and the Life of the Mind, I think it is. Books, you should remember that. The Gospel and the Mind, there you go. Fantastic book as well. And there are some others out there that I mentioned in the paper or that I could point you to. But this one has, I think, probably the biggest, most comprehensive list I've found of these different practices. And what I like about it then, as you can see in my categories, mental practices of the mind. But he also talks about physical practices. You eat well, rest well. I mean, that was one of the most fascinating ones to me, is figure out how much rest you need and get that. Don't get too much, don't get too little. So I figure out how much rest I need. As I'm getting older, I need more. So I'm needing to change my schedule a little bit, and that's what I'm finding. And so we have to adjust those things. But even down to like what you eat and getting exercise and fresh air, and I'm just thinking, wow, so often, the intellectual life, we just think about thinking all the time. And here he's talking about the practices of being a healthy person. And then he goes into your moral and spiritual aspects. He talks about relational things, right? This one's kind of fascinating. When you read the book, there's lots of good quotes on relational there. Sometimes it sounds like he's like, people will get in your way, shun them. And then he turns around on the next page and he's like, people are your most valuable resource. And you're like, huh? He spends the whole time in the intellectual life, and one of the main things that stands out is he says, don't read too many books. And I'm like, I gotta throw this book away. But then he turns around and he explains what he means by that. He's like, don't just read frivolous things. He says, read things that you want your mind to be filled with. And this is something I reflected on before. How many of you read Sherlock Holmes' Studying Scarlet? Okay, I highly recommend Sherlock Holmes. Actually, my wife was listening to the audiobook the other day, and I told her, I felt bad for her. She's like 2/3 of the way in, she's like, I'm really confused. I said, yeah, so with my students, I always tell them to read the first 19 pages, and then skip to A Scandal in Bohemia, and after they read all the short stories, go back and read the rest of A Study in Scarlet. So since most of you didn't raise your hand, do that, and you'll like Sherlock Holmes more, because the Study in Scarlet gets weird and confusing, but it's also where Holmes meets Watson, so you kind of need to read it. So I just say, read the first 19 pages, then skip, and then come back and finish it later. So good advice for you, I think. But anyway, in this first meeting, one of the things that happens is that Holmes is unaware of the Copernican view of the solar system, and Watson's losing his mind about it. He's like, how in the world do you not know that the Earth goes around the sun? And he says, it's not really valuable to my work. And so he just doesn't. And he uses an incredible analogy. He says the brain is like a mental attic, and you can only fit so much stuff in there. And eventually, the next thing you put in requires you to remove something else. So you don't want to put in junk and remove the really useful things. So he says, organize your mind and only put the things in there that are useful for your work. And I go, man, that's amazing. So I've been reflecting on that for several years, and then as I'm reading Sir Talange, that's what he's saying. Don't read too many books if the books that you're reading are feeding your mind with empty things that are just pushing out the really valuable facts. So I still feel justified in reading lots of books, so I'm going to be okay. I was getting worried for a second. All right, so I'm going to kind of pause there. I won't say stop there because we have time left and I want us to have that time. But I'm basically just going to suggest Certalange has some incredible practices. You should read them and take what you think is helpful and put that into practice. So if you go, hey Kyle, what do you think are some good practices in the intellectual life? I'll go, here you go, I gave them to you. So with that in mind, I actually want to just kind of open it up for some conversation. I'll take any questions you have about kind of the introductory material, but then I'd really love to hear from you. How do you try to spark the intellectual life in your students, or what are some practices that you find are helpful for you? And I'm happy to share some of my particular ones, not Certalange's ones, in that process as well. Do you have any questions or comments about the introductory material first? Yes.
I've homeschooled 7 kids and now tutor kids in classical conversation, and there's a point in development that I continue to wrestle with, and it's where the point they get where they can really wrestle with material at the dialectic stage, they seem to hit, their curiosity seems to be less. So right when you get them where they can have these discussions and they just seem to have lost all their wonder and curiosity for a little bit. I notice it raising boys, and now I see them get to the other side and it's like, okay, But do you have any, just for wrestling and for parents to be patient through that stage when you're trying to stir up curiosity in every way you can, and you built the atmosphere and done everything you know how to do, and you're modeling it, and you're still kind of getting that just kind of quiet, not knowing what's going on.
Well, that's a fantastic question, and my colleagues will tell you that I am really well suited for 10th through 12th grade, and there's a reason I don't teach 7th and 8th. I have a 7th grader now. My daughter is now in 7th grade, so this is fun. And then the 9th graders, there's always kind of this, how do we do this? Because I experienced that where it's kind of like this lull of, I'm not really sure what I think about all this right now. Because it got a lot harder, and I don't really see the end goal yet. And so I really just kind of feel like, I'm working really hard and I'm not sure why. And I think what I've found that has proven effective in a few ways is, first of all, I will sometimes pause class, and I realize that sometimes we feel like, gotta get through this, gotta get through this, gotta get through this. And I'm just, for better or worse, I think better, sometimes just step back from that, and I just have a conversation with them as a class. And I just recast that vision for them. And a lot of times what I end up telling them is, part of the reason I sometimes get frustrated with my students is that I have a vision for who they could be that's greater than the vision they have for themselves. And I go, I believe in you more than you believe in you, and that's a problem right now. But here's what I see, and here's what we're trying to do for you or do to you, depending on their state at that moment. And really just try to go, this is what we can see at the end of all of this. And sometimes that sparks some curiosity, it sparks some desire, it helps them go, but I want that, how do I get there? There's an excellent book on spiritual disciplines by Donald Whitney, in which he begins by telling the story of a child who's doing these piano lessons, and he's kind of like clunking at the keys, and he's like, man, I hate this, why does my mom make me do this an hour every day? And he says, imagine that like an angel, I think it was an angel, transports you to this music hall, this beautiful music hall, and some piano virtuoso is playing this beautiful piece. And he says, that's you in 20 years. All of a sudden, that hour-long clunking at the keys makes more sense because we see what we're meant to become. And he goes, scripturally, we know what we're meant to become. We're sons and daughters of God who are becoming like Christ. So if we can see what that vision looks like, it makes the tediousness of the work right now a lot easier. I think that's one way that I've found, just trying to communicate that vision of why we're doing that. Another thing I try to do is just getting conversations with students about, well, what are you interested in? And I try to find parallels. I think one of Christine's talks is going to be on 7 laws of teaching. And, one of those laws is that we teach them things that they don't know by virtue of things that they do know. And so I go, okay, maybe they don't really get really excited about what we're reading in class, but what are they excited about? And sometimes I'm able to find points of connection there and build off what they enjoy and show them how that can point us to something greater. And that can be effective. And then I think, as I mentioned, just demonstrating excitement and joy and love for what we do. You know, if I walk into class and I go, okay, well, we got to read Athanasius today. Pull out your books. Like, they're done. But if I go in and man, we get to read Athanasius today. This is the greatest thing ever. And they're like, you're weird. So, yes, I own it. Let's read this. And I get them excited about it. That can be helpful too. And then after that, I think one of the things that I've noticed is, and this is a tendency that I can fall into. For instance, let's say they ask me a question freshman year, and I know we cover it in a unit junior year. Like, oh, you'll learn that junior year. They don't care junior year if I don't answer it freshman year. And that's a hard tension, because I really don't want to go, there's a reason there's a whole unit on it junior year. I can't answer it right now without all the background information. You won't understand it. But that's okay that they won't understand it all. What I'm saying is there is an answer for that. I have an answer for that. And someday you'll understand the answer to that. And they go, well, I better work hard so that someday I'll understand the answer to that. And I think that's one of the things that's potentially dangerous when we talk about the grammar stage, the dialectic stage, and the rhetoric stage, is we tell them, well, you're not at that stage yet, so you're not ready for the answer. So we'll get there later. And I just go, if the kid has a question now, I don't care if they're in 3rd grade or 10th grade, if they have the question now, let's find them an answer now. And what I think is helpful is, first of all, when we've done the hard work to have a lot of the answers, but then also when we're humble enough to go, I don't know the answer, but I'll go find it out. Because that's modeling for them the intellectual life. I don't know, I want to know, I can go figure out how to know. And that proves helpful as well, because they know, hey, you care about me because you were willing to answer my question or go find an answer to my question. And so, yeah, if they're in 5th grade and they're asking that question, we are not prepared to answer it and don't try to answer it, or if we just push it back to you, hey, you'll get there when you're in 10th grade, by 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, they still have that question, they don't have an answer, and they just go, you know what, mom, teacher, headmaster, they don't have an answer to that question because there is no answer to that question, and they just kind of harden their hearts to it. So that's a really long answer to your question, but those are some things that I think about a lot. Yeah, thanks. Anybody else practices of the intellectual life that you try to do? How do you find time when there is none? Thoughts? Yeah, Kyle?
Just more a question. I'm curious. Like, it seems to me like one of my questions is immediately like, what are obstacles to this? And for me personally, I think one of the biggest obstacles is distraction. Right, the fact that I have a phone in my pocket that constantly demands my attention and things like that. So I'm mostly throwing that out there as a question and curiosity. Like, how have people combated the level of distraction that technology in our society puts before us? Because it seems like one of the things you've talked about is the level of intentionality that we have to bring and stuff like that. And it seems like the phone in my pocket is an enemy to some of those things.
So it absolutely is.
I'm curious your thoughts and others. Do you?
Sure. Well, I'll answer that quicker this time. One thing I do is I basically bring a book everywhere I go. And so if I'm at a basketball game for our students, they think I'm not watching. I only read during timeouts and halftime. Okay, but I bring a book with me because otherwise the 3 minutes between quarters, if I'm not talking to someone, I'd pull out my phone. And instead I just pull out a book and I'm reading and they're like, nerd, guilty. I don't care. So I bring books with me everywhere I go because you inevitably, go get your oil changed and it takes longer than you expected, or you have to go fix your tires, or really it's all car stuff that takes time in life. Going and waiting in the dentist office. I always have a book with me so that I can read in that time. The other thing I've started doing is I will only check my email before school and after school. I have this little block of time in the middle of the day for my plan hour, and I would find that I would used to go, I haven't checked my email in 5 hours, I should check, I gotta respond to that. I should respond to that, but I don't want to right now. And all of a sudden 40 minutes have gone by, and I haven't really done anything with the email. It's still there to be done. It's like, So I just set it aside. I put my phone away, and I just sit there, and some days I grade, but a lot of times I use that time for my reading, because it's the most likely time that I'm not interrupted. And that's one of the things he talks about is, and this was life-changing for me, honestly life-changing, and I have it in there somewhere, but he says it's not just the fact that you are not interrupted, it's that you know you will not be interrupted. And I thought, that's so true, because if I have an hour block, but I know students may be coming in to ask questions, or if I have an hour block at home and I know my kids may be coming in, the amount of work I get done is not nearly as much as if I go, hey dear, I'm gonna go up to the office for an hour on a Sunday afternoon. That hour, I seem to get like 4 hours of work done. Because not only am I not interrupted, I know I won't be interrupted. Like no one else is coming in there. And it's amazing how much that makes a difference. So finding those kinds of times as well. But yeah, bring a book everywhere you go. As long as you don't mind looking like a nerd. Other things that you guys have done?
On his media with students, I wondered how you deal with them, their quick desire to Google summaries. I mean, that you really can't keep them from doing for difficult books.
Yeah.
Do you think that's, I mean, that's just something,
Yeah, I'm kind of the jerk who asks questions that SparkNotes doesn't ask. You read a SparkNotes summary and I go, what did they leave out? That's what we're going to write an essay about. It takes a little extra time, but it's kind of fun. Or I read books that SparkNotes doesn't care about, which, you know, is getting lesser and lesser. They cover everything, but yeah. And then we have no cell phones at school policy, which is really amazing. And then we have one computer lab, and I basically try to never let them go there. So that helps too. I also do a lot of reading in class with them and talk to them in that moment, so there's no chance to go Google the summary and somebody else's interpretation and then come back and try to reproduce it as their own. It's just on the spot. Hey, what's going on here? And they're like, no clue. And I don't do that to make them feel bad. I do that to go, okay, I know in my I have 25 people in a class. I need to identify more than just once a quarter or every few weeks on a test how much they know, and so I'm able to figure out in that moment they're really not getting it, and then I can talk with them and go, hey, what are you not getting? Because it seems like the rest of the class is probably getting it, and there's only a few that aren't. And you can highlight that better, but you know, technology really is a difficult challenge because there is so much knowledge at our fingertips. How do you convince them it's worth knowing things that you don't just Google? Hey, memorize this poem and recite it. Like, I could just look the poem up on my phone. You could, but it's not the same. So you gotta show them that. Yeah.
Well, this is my first year to teach classical, so I know less than probably anyone in this room, but a couple of things that I found helpful is on your phone and with books, the Kindle app is free, and almost all of your classic books are out of copyright, so it's just a cornucopia of reading material. And I always have my phone, so I always have a book.
Yeah.
And the other thing, sometimes I found, I teach American history, some of it can be pretty dry, you know, hard to keep them focused. And what I try to do, and I encourage them to do it, is to find what I call the Ripley moments. Because everybody or everything, if you dig a little deeper, has a really interesting story to it that might not even be on the same track as what your topic or what, let's say this person was the head of the railroads, but you find out that his grandfather was Vice President of the United States.
Yeah.
I try to dig out little facts like that so they have other things to anchor to, and they'll, you know, if you ask them about this topic, they'll go, oh, that's the one that, fill in the gap, and then sometimes the rest of the knowledge flows. It seems to work in time.
That's good. Or would you connect that to other classes, right?
Right,
Yeah.
sure.
Christy?
Yeah, I was going to come back to your question because it's a serious plague in our school to look things up, especially now that we're on modern American literature. They can find everything. I can no longer find short stories that they can't find a summary of, kind of thing. But a couple of times a year, I do the recast division. And the way that I do it is we look up Psalm 23 on Shmoop. You should read Psalm 23 on Shmoop. And then we talk about, okay, here is Shmoop's version, which is strangely neutral. It's absolutely objectified. It's just, there's nothing personal about God being your shepherd at all. It's just there's a caretaker out there. And it's the wording of it is so odd because the students know it so well. They're like, what's wrong with that? And we talk through what you miss from the experience of the scripture and reading it as it was intended. And if you do that, and the other example I use is from the Scarlet Letter, which I teach in the fall, we look again at a Spark Notes and a Schmoop and a Cliff Notes online, and there's a few others out there. We look at the first paragraph of the Scarlet Letter and the first paragraph on a different site, and we talk about what we miss. And though those who are trying to condense it and summarize it are trying to keep the spirit of it, they lose the experience of the beauty of the language and the almost the personal nature of it. And when I've done the Psalm 23, they get it. They understand it. That when you choose to look up a summary, you are actually you are exacting a cost, and you need to understand what you're choosing to do. I can't prevent you from it, but I want to appeal to their integrity to experience it and not lose the experience.
Do you start the year with the Psalm 23 one?
Mm-hmm. I do.
You just wrote about that not too long ago. I read that one.
It's a great approach, because you're accepting that this is gonna be tempting, and I wanna give you a piece of why that might not be.
Do you think it helps that they always know that you know that Sparkness is out there, but when you just put it before them and go, I know this is there, I know it's a temptation, I know you probably have done this or are going to do this,
Right.
There's a relief,
but I'm
yeah.
going to appeal directly to that and show you what you're missing. That's so good. That's awesome. Other practices? Thoughts, questions? Any stories of like big wins with students who got really excited about something nerdy? My sophomores just told me the other day, we were reading John of Damascus. It's really hard. And they're like, this is so hard. This isn't easy like Athanasius. And I just thought, I did something good. I did something good, because when they first picked up Athanasius, it was like, and then we read John of Damascus after like 6 weeks on Athanasius, and they're like, this is not easy like Athanasius. And I thought, I love what I do. This is great. Now they're reading Anselm, so we'll see what they think. I told them it was easier than John of Damascus. See if they believe me. So that's kind of fun when you have those moments when you're like, who would ever give a 10th grader those things to read? And then when we give it to them to read and they're like, yeah, this was actually pretty easy. Just like, this is great. This is fun stuff. Okay. Well, I know we started late. We're technically out of time then. But I'm around all weekend. I'll be moving back and forth, making sure everything's set up, ready to go. So if you have any questions in the hallways, let me know. I really would love your feedback on my super rough draft as I've been exploring this some more. Definitely want to look into this in greater detail. And then I'm always just looking for ways to cultivate this in myself, and how do I transfer that to my students. And if I could really just sum it up in one way, I would just say when you will share of yourself, then I think they respect us a lot more than we sometimes believe. And so they may not ever want to admit it, and it's kind of terrifying to think about, but they want to be like you. And if they see you love what you learn, they see you pursue that in your own time, in varying degrees, they come to do likewise. And so just encourage you to cultivate it first in yourself, and then share that with your students. Be transparent with them, be vulnerable with them, tell them where you fail in that, and they're going to be like, oh, I totally understand. But when they hear those wins, they hear the things you learn,